Amber Reese called the police at 3 a.m., her voice trembling as she claimed her husband Brian was missing. But behind her frantic words, a chilling truth was slowly emerging. As detectives dug deeper into the lives of Amber and Brian, they uncovered a series of lies, a hidden affair, and a meticulously planned murder that no one saw coming. What really happened inside that house that night? Amber's carefully constructed world was about to unravel, revealing a darkness that would leave the entire community in shock. At exactly 3:02 a.m., the Arlington County Emergency Dispatch Center received a call from a woman who sounded breathless, on the verge of panic. Her voice trembled as she gave her name, Amber Reese, and reported that something terrible had happened inside her home. The dispatcher noted that Amber's tone was frantic yet oddly measured. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her words were precise. There was blood on the floor, things were broken, and her husband Brian was missing. The most puzzling part? She never once asked for medical help. Not for him. Not for herself. Just police. Within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars rolled up to the Reese's modest suburban home in a quiet, well-manicured neighborhood. The street was lined with identical brick houses, still wrapped in darkness under the early morning sky. Porch lights flickered on as sleepy neighbors peeked from behind curtains, curious about the flashing red and blue lights. Amber stood outside on the porch in a long white robe. Her hair was disheveled, her bare feet dirty, and her face pale. She clutched her phone tightly in one hand, her eyes locked on the approaching officers with an almost vacant look. The officers approached cautiously. One began to ask routine questions, while the other stepped inside the home to assess the scene. The moment they entered the living room, it became clear this was more than a missing person case. Furniture was overturned. A wine bottle lay shattered near the fireplace, staining the pale carpet with deep crimson streaks. A table lamp was broken, and there were drag marks on the floor leading toward the back of the house. Drops of blood were scattered in a pattern, suggesting movement, but not a clean one. Someone had struggled. As the initial search continued, the officers took note of what wasn't there. There was no sign of forced entry. Every window was locked from the inside. The doors were shut, tight. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Brian's wallet and keys were still in the foyer drawer. His car was in the garage. Even his watch, one he wore every day, was sitting on the kitchen counter beside a used glass of wine. Amber told the police she had gone to bed early. Around midnight, she woke up and noticed Brian wasn't in bed. She went downstairs and found the living room in chaos. When she called out for him, there was no answer. That's when she claimed to have seen the blood and dialed 911. When asked why she hadn't searched the backyard or called any of his friends, she said she was too scared to move. She just stood there, frozen, waiting for help. Her story sounded rehearsed. It lacked emotion but not detail. The officers couldn't ignore the inconsistencies. There were no footprints in the blood. No evidence anyone had tried to leave the house after the apparent struggle. And yet, Brian was nowhere to be found. Amber was brought in for questioning, and crime scene technicians arrived to process the house. Every inch of the home was photographed and documented. Forensic teams began testing the blood, collecting fibers, and lifting prints. One thing became immediately evident. Whatever had happened inside that house, it didn't just happen suddenly. There were signs that tension had been building. The shattered wine bottle, the knocked-over frames, the disturbed dining table set for 2. It all painted a picture of a night that had started with intimacy and ended in violence. Outside, neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering theories. They all said the same thing. Amber and Brian seemed like a perfect couple. No fights, no drama. Always smiling. Always together. But no one really knew what went on behind closed doors. By dawn, detectives arrived. The blood found at the scene was confirmed to be human. Multiple officers canvassed the area, while others searched the surrounding property. The backyard showed no signs of disturbance, no footsteps in the dew-covered grass. The garage had only one car. The basement was locked. Amber claimed she hadn't gone down there in weeks. When asked if she would allow a search, she nodded. silently. As the sun rose and bathed the house in light, it became clear that something terrible had happened inside. The only question was whether Amber was truly a victim, or the person responsible for whatever had taken place just hours earlier. Amber and Brian Reese were the couple most neighbors envied. From the outside, their life looked nearly perfect. They lived in a beautifully maintained two-story brick house on a quiet cul-de-sac, complete with manicured hedges, a gleaming black SUV in the driveway, and a charming golden retriever named Toby. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was the picture of domestic bliss. Brian, a respected corporate finance executive at a Washington, D.C. firm, was known for his calm demeanor and polished appearance. Amber, a part-time piano teacher who worked with children from the neighborhood, was considered kind, artistic, and gracious. They attended neighborhood barbecues, sent holiday cards every year, and hosted small but elegant dinner parties. Social media. They were all smiles, vacation photos from Cabo, birthday celebrations, romantic anniversary posts. Everything about their life was curated to seem idyllic. But as detectives dug deeper, that image began to crack. Behind the filtered photos and polite smiles was a marriage that had been quietly deteriorating for months, possibly even years. Brian's work often kept him away from home, and friends reported that Amber had grown increasingly withdrawn in recent months. Though she maintained a calm exterior, there were signs of emotional strain that many had overlooked. She had stopped hosting gatherings. She had canceled several piano lessons without explanation. Some neighbors noted she had even started losing weight rapidly, and her cheerful tone had vanished. At the time, no one thought much of it. What the investigators discovered next completely shifted the direction of the case. While reviewing Brian's financial records, they found something odd. 3 months before he disappeared, Brian had transferred a significant amount of money, over $40,000, to an individual named Claire Rudd. The payments were spaced out, just small enough not to raise flags from the bank, but when added together, they were impossible to ignore. Claire was not a family member. She wasn't a co-worker. She wasn't a known friend. She wasn't even listed in his contacts. A background check on Claire revealed she was a 27-year-old real estate agent who lived less than 30 minutes away. She was unmarried and had no criminal history. But there was something else, a series of text messages between her and Brian that had been backed up to the cloud. The content was unmistakably romantic. For over a year, Brian had been involved in a secret relationship. He had even gone so far as to lease a small condo under Claire's name, with rent payments pulled discreetly from his personal account. Amber, by all accounts, had no knowledge of the affair, or at least that's what investigators initially thought. It turned out that Amber had quietly hired a private investigator just 6 weeks before Brian vanished. The PI's notes, found in her email drafts folder, showed photos of Brian and Claire entering and exiting the condo at odd hours. There were time-stamped images, location tracking reports, and even a copy of Brian's updated life insurance policy, which named Claire, not Amber, as the sole beneficiary. It had been signed and submitted just 3 weeks before his disappearance. Investigators now had reason to believe that Amber had discovered the affair and the life insurance change before the night of the incident. Though Amber never mentioned Claire during her police interviews, her internet search history suggested she had been looking up terms like changing life insurance beneficiaries, affair divorce laws in Virginia, and, more disturbingly, how to remove blood from carpet without trace. Meanwhile, neighbors began coming forward with their own recollections. One woman claimed to have seen Amber dragging a large black garbage bag across the backyard patio the night Brian disappeared. She didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was trash. Another neighbor mentioned hearing raised voices that evening, something she had never heard before in the Reese household. Still, no one thought to intervene. The perfect couple was now a puzzle of contradictions. What had once seemed like a fairy tale marriage now appeared to be a slow-burning conflict hiding in plain sight. With every new piece of information, investigators were starting to wonder if what happened at 3 a.m. wasn't spontaneous at all, but the final act of something that had been planned for weeks, possibly longer. As the investigation into Brian Reese's disappearance continued, the most puzzling aspect of the case was the lack of any direct evidence linking Amber to his death. At first, it seemed like a tragic case of an unexpected home invasion, or a sudden violent act by an outsider. However, as the days passed, the details surrounding the scene began to feel increasingly staged. Despite the disorder in the living room, there was no sign of forced entry, and everything in the house appeared undisturbed, except for the violence that had occurred inside. The initial reports had raised more questions than answers, and detectives couldn't ignore the eerie calmness in Amber's voice when she made the 911 call. The breakthrough came when police examined Brian's phone. Initially, they had assumed that the device was somewhere in the house or the car, but when they found it buried under a pile of old boxes in the garage, the picture of that fateful night began to shift. The phone had been recording audio when it was last used just hours before Amber's 911 call. Listening to the recording sent chills down the investigators' spines. At first, it seemed like just background noise, the creak of old wooden floors, muffled sounds of a conversation. But as they adjusted the volume, it became clear that an argument was taking place. Amber's voice was audible, demanding something from Brian, accusing him of betrayal. The tone was sharp, filled with frustration, but there was something else in her words, an underlying edge of panic that seemed to have built up over time. Brian's responses were barely discernible, but it was clear he was trying to calm her down. He spoke of leaving, but it wasn't just about leaving the room. It was clear now. He was planning to leave the marriage entirely. The argument escalated as the recording continued. Amber's voice became more frantic, and a loud crash echoed in the background, followed by a brief silence. The next sound heard on the recording was a soft shuffle, as if someone had moved across the floor. But after that, all was quiet. For several minutes nothing could be heard, and it was as if time had stopped. The phone eventually stopped recording, but the damage had already been done. The recording painted a picture of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. At first, Amber denied that there was any argument that night. She claimed that they had a small disagreement, but that Brian had gone for a walk to clear his head. She insisted that when she found the blood and called the police, she had no idea where he had gone. But the evidence from Brian's phone contradicted this version of events. It was clear that something had gone wrong, something violent, and it all started with the betrayal of an affair and the hidden financial dealings Brian had been keeping from her. The more detectives listened to the recording, the more questions piled up. There were no clear answers about what happened after the crash, but the silence that followed seemed to imply that the fight had taken a darker turn. Was it possible that Brian had been knocked unconscious, or worse? And if so, how had Amber managed to keep him hidden for so long? Had she acted alone, or was there someone else involved? A thorough search of the house revealed more chilling discoveries. Forensic teams found traces of blood in several unusual places, near the kitchen drain, along the hallway floor, and near the laundry room. They even discovered a butcher knife, which appeared to have been hastily cleaned but still showed signs of use. It was found in the dishwasher, though it seemed like it had been used for more than just food preparation. The knife's handle was smeared with blood, and there were more traces on the countertop nearby. The strangest part of all was the lack of evidence pointing to a struggle. Brian's shoes were neatly placed by the door, his wallet still on the entryway table, and the garage door had been left open, but it didn't make sense. If someone had been forced into a violent encounter, there would have been more signs of resistance, more evidence that a struggle had ensued. Yet everything suggested that Brian had been caught off guard, and there was an eerie lack of urgency in Amber's actions. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't rushed for help. Even stranger were the signs that Amber had been preparing for something. In the weeks leading up to Brian's disappearance, she had purchased large amounts of bleach and cleaning supplies. Her phone search history revealed disturbing searches: how to clean bloodstains, how to erase DNA traces, and how to hide a body. These searches were all done in the days before the night in question. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that Amber's life was far from the perfect picture she had presented to the outside world. Her calm demeanor after The incident was now viewed with suspicion. The police were convinced Amber knew far more than she was letting on. What had started as a missing person case had evolved into something much darker. A murder investigation where the wife, once a grieving spouse, was now the prime suspect. As the investigation into Brian Reese's disappearance unfolded, the focus shifted more intensely onto Amber. Detectives began to piece together the fragments of her life, uncovering a complex web of secrets, lies, and motives that painted an increasingly sinister portrait of the woman who had once seemed so composed and innocent. Amber's friends, colleagues, and even a few distant relatives, when questioned, all offered the same impression. Amber was meticulous, a perfectionist who prided herself on control. They described her as warm and charming, but there was always a sense of something she was hiding, something below the surface. Several people mentioned that, in the past few months, Amber had become more withdrawn, even distant. Her once regular piano lessons had dwindled, and she had become less involved in social gatherings. Some friends described noticing her obsession with maintaining an immaculate home. Every detail was precise, almost compulsive, and according to one of her former colleagues, she had been showing signs of extreme stress, often muttering about her husband's behavior, but never saying much more. The deeper the investigation went, the more Amber's life seemed out of sync with the image she had projected. Her relationship with Brian had always appeared perfect, an ideal match of ambition and grace. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Neighbors reported that Brian had been seen coming home late from work with a tense expression, as though he was constantly on edge. Some of them recalled seeing him take short walks by himself in the evenings, as if he were escaping something at home. Amber, on the other hand, had remained largely inside, attending to her teaching and domestic duties. It was unclear whether the tension between them had been brewing for years, or if it was the recent affair that had truly shattered their marriage. A significant breakthrough in the case came when a witness came forward, a former colleague of Brian's from the finance firm where he had worked for the last decade. The man, named Thomas Eldridge, had been close to Brian, and he revealed something startling. According to Eldridge, Brian had recently been acting unusually. The pressure of his secret life, the affair with Claire Rudd, had begun to take a toll on him. Eldridge also claimed that Brian had been involved in an affair for several months before the night of his disappearance. What was more unsettling was Eldridge's admission that Brian had been making plans to leave Amber for good. He had even spoken about moving in with Claire and making her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. This revelation cast a shadow over Amber's claims of innocence. She had known about Brian's affair, of course. The private investigator she had hired had provided irrefutable evidence of it. But what she had failed to mention to the police was that she had become aware of the affair long before Brian's disappearance. In fact, Amber had known about Claire for months, and rather than confronting her husband, she had quietly started planning her next move. She had been watching him, observing his every move, and gathering the pieces she needed to exact some form of control over the situation. She had even been in touch with divorce attorneys before the incident occurred. But Amber's actions, it seemed, weren't solely motivated by the affair. Investigators discovered something chilling in her financial records. Over the past few months, Amber had been steadily withdrawing large sums of money from the couple's joint account, enough to suggest that she had been preparing for something more than just a divorce. She had also been purchasing expensive materials, cleaning agents, heavy-duty tarps, and tools for disposal. There were several transactions for these items made in the days leading up to Brian's disappearance. Amber had been preparing for the worst, and it seemed she had known exactly what she intended to do. The forensic analysis of Amber's phone provided yet another chilling piece of the puzzle. Investigators uncovered a series of messages exchanged between her and an unknown number, messages that were chilling in their cryptic content. The unknown person had advised Amber on what to do in the event of a final confrontation with Brian, telling her to stay calm and give him space. Amber had repeatedly asked how to cover up the situation, how to make sure no one would find out. The person had offered step-by-step advice, telling her how to hide evidence and remove traces of blood. Amber had meticulously followed these instructions, down to the smallest detail. What had once seemed like a random act of violence now appeared to be a calculated murder, the culmination of months of emotional manipulation and careful planning. Amber's story had begun to unravel, and the more investigators dug, the clearer it became that she had orchestrated Brian's disappearance and likely his death. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, there was still one lingering question. How had she done it? The final breakthrough came when a search of Amber's car revealed an item that had been long overlooked, a small, blood-stained cloth hidden in the back seat. The forensic team confirmed that it matched the blood found in the living room. It was the missing link. Amber had tried to clean up the scene, but in her haste, she had missed a key piece of evidence. The cloth had been used to wipe down the knife, and it had been discarded in a place that Amber likely thought was out of sight. This discovery was enough to finally charge Amber with the murder of her husband, Brian Reese. Now, Amber faced a future of uncertainty and consequence, her carefully constructed facade torn apart. The woman who had once been seen as the perfect wife and mother was now the prime suspect in a chilling murder case, one that had unfolded behind closed doors, and one that had been waiting to be uncovered for far too long. The trial of Amber. Reese began with intense media coverage, the public fascinated by the woman who had once seemed like the epitome of grace and control. The case was one of the most sensational to hit the local court system, and the courtroom was filled with spectators, eager to see what would unfold. The prosecution presented its case with shocking clarity, weaving together the timeline of events, leading up to Brian Reese's disappearance and eventual murder. The mounting evidence was overwhelming. The recordings from Brian's phone, the bloodstains found in various places around the house, Amber's suspicious financial transactions, and her chilling actions in the days leading up to the crime. All these pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Amber had planned and executed her husband's murder with cold precision. Amber's defense team, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the audio recording from Brian's phone, while damning, could not conclusively prove that Amber was responsible for his death. They suggested that there might have been another person involved, someone who had attacked Brian in a fit of rage. They pointed out that Amber had never directly confessed to the crime and that she had acted in a state of shock when she called the police, truly believing that something had happened to her husband, but not knowing exactly what. They questioned the reliability of the forensic analysis, hinting that the bloodstains could have been planted by investigators eager to pin the crime on her. Despite the defense's efforts, the evidence against Amber only grew stronger with each passing day. The audio recording of the argument between Amber and Brian was played for the jury, and the chilling silence that followed the crash was enough to send a wave of unease through the courtroom. The forensic experts testified that Amber's actions, her purchases of cleaning supplies and her careful planning, were the hallmarks of someone preparing for a violent confrontation, not a simple argument between spouses. The blood found on the butcher knife in the dishwasher, the cloth with traces of Brian's blood found in the back of Amber's car, and the bloodstains in unusual places around the house all suggested a deliberate effort to cover up the crime. What stood out the most, however, was the discovery of Amber's meticulous planning. She had not just been preparing for a divorce, as she had claimed. She had been preparing for something far more sinister. The texts she had exchanged with an unknown person, advising her on how to hide evidence and cover up her tracks, were proof that Amber had been methodical in her approach to Brian's murder. The prosecution argued that Amber's calm demeanor in the aftermath of the crime was not that of a grieving wife, but that of a woman who had executed a cold, calculated act and was now trying to avoid detection. As the trial progressed, Amber's demeanor began to shift. She had initially appeared composed, even sympathetic, but as the evidence mounted against her, cracks began to show. The weight of the case seemed to take its toll. Amber's eyes became vacant, her body language stiff and defensive. She was no longer the poised, charming woman who had once seemed above reproach. The more she listened to the testimony, the more apparent it became that her defense was crumbling, and the truth of what had happened in her home that night was becoming undeniable. Amber's decision to take the stand in her own defense turned out to be a critical mistake. During cross-examination, the prosecutor hammered her with questions, forcing her to account for her actions on the night of Brian's disappearance. Her responses became increasingly erratic, and her carefully crafted story began to unravel. When asked why she had not called the police immediately after the argument, Amber hesitated. Her explanation, that she had been too distraught to think clearly, sounded rehearsed, and the jury didn't buy it. When asked about the bloodstains in the house, she became defensive, insisting that they must have been a result of an accident, but her explanations were weak and inconsistent. The more she tried to justify her actions, the less credible she seemed. The final blow came when the jury was shown the video footage from the garage, a hidden camera installed in the corner that had caught Amber on tape in the hours after Brian's disappearance. The footage showed Amber calmly walking through the garage, collecting cleaning supplies and loading them into the trunk of her car. She did this without a hint of panic, without the usual signs of a woman who had just discovered her husband missing or in danger. The footage, combined with all the other evidence, left no room for doubt. Amber had killed her husband, and she had carefully planned every step of the murder and its aftermath. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The weight of the case, the destruction of a family, and the deception that had unfolded over the past few weeks hung heavily in the air. The deliberation lasted several hours, but it was clear that the evidence had left an indelible mark on the jury. When the verdict was finally read aloud, it was met with a hushed silence. Amber Reese was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps of disbelief, some of them from the gallery, some from the defense team, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the decision. Amber's face remained expressionless as the guilty verdict was handed down. She had no tears, no visible sign of emotion. It was as though she had already resigned herself to the inevitable. Her life, once filled with promise and perfection, had been shattered beyond repair. The perfect wife and mother had become a cold, calculating murderer. And the truth had finally come to light. As Amber was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the media swarmed, eager to report on the fall of a once respected woman who had managed to hide her true nature for so long. The case would be remembered for years to come, a haunting reminder of the lengths to which some people would go to maintain control and conceal their darkest secrets. For Amber Reese, there was no escape from the consequences of her actions. She had called the police at 3 a.m., but it was not a cry for help. It was a final, desperate attempt to cover up the truth. And in the end, the truth had found its way to the surface.